So it's lovely for me to be able to introduce Associate Professor Jantina De Vries today as part of our Division of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry seminar series. And Jantina and I share a surname, but as far as we know, we are not related. She is very much a contemporary Dutch person. I'm a 17th century Dutch person, but have been in South Africa probably longer than she has. But Jantina is a bioethicist, and it's great for us in child and adolescent mental health to have somebody come and talk to us about bioethics. And I think what makes Jantina extra special is, even though she's European, and if I remember, you did your PhD or DPhil at Oxford, she has a particular interest in ethics and bioethics in relation to sub-Saharan Africa, and in relation to research, particularly genetic and genomic research in sub-Saharan African populations. And so I think that's a very, very particular skill set in terms of helping us think, how do we build knowledge and skills around genetic, genomic, and other research in sub-Saharan Africa but doing it in an ethical way, because once we apply a sub-Saharan African lens to what we do, it might look different from the kind of ethical implications in other parts of the world. So Jantina, great to have you join us today. And I'm going to hand straight over to you to talk about this really important topic. And I've warned Jantina that we might also want to probe her on some more clinically applied questions, not just about the ethics and bioethics of research with children and adolescents. So with that, over to you.
Excellent, cool. So I'll just thanks Petrus. So hi everyone, lovely to be with you. Hopefully the first of perhaps other interactions as well, because it sounds like there are other things I can speak to you about that are closer to the work that I actually do. I don't work on consent that much. And if that would be of interest, I'd be very happy to speak to you about some of my other work in future seminars as well. The topic of today's discussion is consent for research, and I try to probe a bit kind of in earlier email interactions with Petrus, what exactly you're looking for in an ethics talk, and who the audience is, because that's always quite important to ensure that I share the right kind of information. And so what I try to do here is two things. One is get you a flavor of kind of the way that we think about consent in ethics discourse. So that's kind of, it's quite a general introductory talk. Apologies for those for whom that, is water under the bridge and you know that stuff really well. I just think that it's often quite important to make sure that you understand some of the theory and the kind of conceptual thinking and the law, I guess, behind consent in research and how we think about that, particularly because what we often think about, is the right thing to, or what we ought to be doing administratively doesn't match what we do in practice, right? Because the reality is messy and the ethics committee wants an idealized picture of what happens. And going back to kind of thinking about what consent is actually trying to do in research can help us think through the practical challenges that arise when we do research. Now, the emphasis, I actually, in preparation for this talk, spent a bit of time looking at clinical kind of scenarios and ethics in adolescent psychiatry particularly, and I decided to actually focus this talk very narrowly on research. And the reason for that is that even though, or whilst there are overlaps between clinical practice and research, I'm not a clinical ethicist, and I don't have I neither have the clinical background nor the ethics training specific to clinical ethics that allows me to authoritatively kind of help people think of or address clinical scenarios. But that said, I do know a lot about ethics, so I'm happy to have those kind of brainstorming discussions about clinical scenarios later on, but as long as you don't expect answers from me, I'm much more comfortable with the research domain. So that's enough about me. Let's see how I advance my slides here. Great. So the first kind of piece of background, the only piece of background that I'd like to sketch, is a broader question about when is research with children allowed? So when are we kind of legitimately allowed to think about involving children, including children with psychiatric conditions, in research? And previously, I think we've seen a bit of a transition in the last kind of decade, perhaps, but there tended to be kind of an a priori assumption that because children are always vulnerable in different ways, and which places them at risk of exploitation, it is therefore, as a general rule, unadvisable to involve them in research. I think it's fair to say that for quite a few years, especially in the past century, that kind of was the dominant paradigm, is that we should be very cautious about involving children in research because they're vulnerable and therefore at risk of exploitation. Where the idea of vulnerability here originates from different elements of childhood. So the one is the evolving psyche, right? So evolving values, evolving ways, evolving cognitive abilities that make them vulnerable, right? They can't, that was the assumption, they can't always oversee kind of the outcomes of potential decisions. And so we really shouldn't be asking them to make decisions about complex things. And also obviously their dependency. So children being dependent on others, mostly adults, for their well-being, that too places them in at risk of exploitation. Now, there's obviously a counter argument to this, which is just hide the video, which is a growing recognition that the exclusion of children from research means that they were subjected to tests or to treatments without those having been properly tested in their bodies, right? So no ideas about how evolving immune systems respond to particular drugs, or no evidence for, in the COVID vaccine, for instance, how their bodies respond to vaccines, and so on and so forth. And so increasingly there is this realization that there really is a balance here between thinking of children as vulnerable and at risk of exploitation versus children having a right to properly tested interventions, therapies, treatments, and so on and so forth. And the way that let me just see what is happening here. Yeah. So the way that that is currently normally kind of considered in research ethics discussions is that we should cautiously proceed with conducting research on or with children. And the criteria for the UCT Ethics Committee, but also the national criteria, are that research with children should be permitted if the research cannot equally be conducted with adults. So if there is no reason, no special reason for why the research ought to be conducted with children, then it should not be conducted with them. But on the other hand, if the outcome of the research is directly relevant to children, right? So if there's likely to be research findings that are going to improve, in our case, healthcare for children, and the risk is reasonable and preferably minimal. So the national guidelines speak about minimal risk, but set against a recognition that sometimes children need to be involved in research where the risk is more than minimal, but still reasonable considering the expected benefits. Then in those cases, if all three of these conditions are satisfied, then research in children is not only permissible, but advisable. So the current state of play is that actually there is an ethical obligation to involve children in research, in ethical research, if it's likely that research will actually benefit those children. So that brings us then to the question of consent, right? So how, if we agree that the involvement of children is important in research, then what we need to think about is, well, how do we go about consent for research in children? And so the majority of my talk will focus on consent itself and the ideas around consent. Now, consent is normally understood as deliberated self-rule And it is one way that we have in research of protecting autonomy. Now, autonomy is a fundamental human right? It's a fundamental human right. It's also a legal right and a constitutional right in South Africa. So all individuals, including children, have a right to autonomy, right? To decide for themselves what happens to them or their bodies. So autonomy, another way of one way of defining autonomy as deliberated self-rule. We protect autonomy in research in two ways. We protect autonomy by having all kinds of regulations and approaches to how we protect privacy. And then we use consent as the second way of ensuring or protecting autonomy in research. So this is really important as kind of one element of the reason for why we think consent is so absolutely paramount. And that is because it protects this fundamental human right, as well as this legal right in South Africa and in most countries in the world. Now, when we speak about consent, we don't only speak about consent, we tend to speak about valid consent. So we distinguish consent from valid consent. Consent in general is understood as the permission that one person gives another to do something to their body or to data about them. So consent is asking people permission for doing something to them that you would not otherwise do, right? So if Petrus came to me in the supermarket and takes a blood sample, that would be really, really socially odd, right? That wouldn't be normally allowed. Consent is the step in between that allows that temporary invasion of my body that would in other circumstances not be considered permissible. So in other words, consent is the permission that we seek when we ask people to give up some of their rights. So the right to privacy, the right to autonomy, right? So right to privacy meaning the right to decide what happens to information that belongs to me, that is about me. If as a researcher or as a medical doctor, you want access to information that is about me, you ask my consent and I'll give you permission to temporarily or for certain purposes access or use that information about me. If it's about biological samples or other biological data, it's the same thing. It's permission, but you ask permission to invade something about me. By that act, I give up certain rights, certain of my rights. Now, valid consent, when we speak about valid consent, we speak about consent that is given by a competent person, so somebody who has capacity, given on the basis of sufficient and comprehensible information. So comprehension as the concept indicating the quality of the information that is provided, on the basis voluntarily, so without undue influence or coercion. So valid consent, just repeating that because it's quite central to how we think about consent in bioethics. So valid consent is consent given on the basis of sufficient information by a competent person, normally a competent adult, but more about that later, without undue influence or coercion, voluntarily. So I'll speak a bit about all three of those concepts, but I'll spend most time speaking about capacity because I think that's the most relevant or pertinent aspect of valid consent that is really key to the work that you all do. Oops. Now how it's a bit inconsistent in how it moves slides. Okay, there you go. Now, in South Africa is one of the only countries in the world that enshrines the right to consent as a constitutional right. Now, it's a bit debatable what that means exactly, but it's really quite important that it's that prominent. So in South Africa, the right to provide informed consent is a constitutional right, not just a legal right. And specifically, Section 12(2)(c) of the Constitution reads that everyone has the right to bodily and psychological integrity which includes the right not to be subjected to medical or scientific experiments without their informed consent. So it's really, I think that's like really significant, that we shouldn't or can't proceed with medical research without informed consent. But that's obviously a bit problematic, because sometimes we do need to do, for good social reasons, we do need to do research on people without their direct informed consent. And so to kind of further substantiate this constitutional right, the National Health Act also describes that research or experimentation on a living person may only be conducted in the prescribed manner and with the written consent of the person. Both of these provisions are somewhat problematic, because written consent is sometimes problematic as well, particularly when doing research with people who don't know how to write or read. But that's kind of beyond the point. What's really important here is that there is a strong legal framework that makes it illegal for people to conduct research without taking consent seriously. Cool. Now what's happening to this image? I'm so sorry, that image doesn't work on the presentation when it goes big. So competency, so speaking here about competency, competency is also called decisional capacity. And decisional capacity is the capacity to make decisions in light of information about the relevant risks, benefits, and consequences of the proposed intervention. So specifically being able to understand relevant information, appreciate the consequences of the situation, and reason about that decision. So in order to think about whether the people we enroll in research are capable of making decisions, they have to show to be able to do certain things. They have to be able to understand the risks, benefits, and consequences, the risk of benefits associated with what they're being asked to do, right? So an intervention, like what are the risks associated to the intervention? What are the benefits of participating for the individual, but also for society? And what are the consequences of different decisions? So deciding to opt in or opt out, how does that affect me and those around me? So understanding that information, then appreciating the consequences of particular situations, and then showing the ability to some extent to reason about your decision. So is the participant, sometimes the patient, able to explain why they decided what their decision was? Now, the capacity to consent is decision specific. It's also, some people would say, decision and time specific. So capacity to consent is not something that is permanent and there all the time. It's something that goes and comes. So in different kinds of situations, I may be more or less able to make decisions that are relevant to me or my health. For women, the typical example is when you're in active labor, it might be difficult to make reasonable decisions is not that difficult perhaps, but reasoned decisions might not be that easy. This point is relevant because we need to, when we start thinking about the capacity to consent, what we need to consider is whether the scope of what we're asking someone to consent to is whether they will be able to make those decisions based on those three criteria I showed in the last slide. So whether they're able to reason through the decision, whether they're in a position to actually oversee the consequences of their decision, and whether they would likely be able to understand the information. And so what this means is that, particularly when involving children, there might be aspects of the research that children are capable of consenting to, And there might be aspects of research that really we need to involve proxies for. And so, for instance, at the most basic level, you can imagine that with very young children, all the information about a study might be shared with the parents, but the child might be able to decide whether or not they want to give an additional blood sample, right? Or whether they want someone to prick them. So there are things that we can kind of section off, and stuff that we can actually ask proxy consent or adults about, and things that we can ask the children about. And so in capacity to consent, it's really important to recognize that this is not a stable, that the capacity to consent is actually specific to what people are being asked to do. Now, really important also in thinking about the capacity to consent is that whether somebody is capable of consenting is completely independent of whether the decision they reach is rational. So as long as the person is able to reason through why they made that decision, whether that decision is rational or not is not so important. So the typical example is somebody refusing a blood transfusion for religious reasons, or an elderly, frail, diabetic 80-year-old refusing the COVID vaccine. Whether we agree with the outcome of their decisions is not as important as whether or not they can do those things that I said in the previous slide. So understand the information, think about the consequences, and reason through why they made that decision. So that's really important, because when people make irrational decisions, and I think that's true in the clinical care context as well as in the research context, it's very tempting to start to question their capacity to consent. But actually, that particular element should be completely taken away out of the kind of estimation of whether someone is capable of consenting. Now, capacity to consent can be assessed formally or informally, and as clinicians, I'm sure you know this, and you've experienced this many times. What often happens in research is that the person recruiting, so the person actually kind of sitting in an office and enrolling patients and explaining the study to them, informally assesses whether the person that they're speaking to is able to consent, right? And if they are suspicious that perhaps, they're not comfortable that the person actually understood, they might then say, well, you know what, I actually think this is fine, and don't worry about it, we'll ask someone else or something like that. So many times in research, when we think about the assessment of a capacity to consent, what we do is kind of an informal assessment. But there are also formal ways of assessing capacity to consent. And as psychiatrists, you might be, and psychologists, you might be familiar with some tools that establish capacity. Some of those tools have been adapted specifically for the research process, and the most well-known and often used is something called the UBAC, which is the capacity to consent scale, which is a list of something like 10, 20 questions about the study itself that participants need to pass if they are to be enrolled. The other really important element is that what seems to be the case from evidence kind of in the consent arena is that what is most important is verbal IQ and cognitive functions rather than age. So even though we're very tempted to put into place all kinds of age restrictions about consent and attribute different degrees of capacity to younger and older children, what actually seems to be more important is whether people are what the law calls sufficiently mature to make these kinds of decisions. And in just kind of with relevance to psychiatry, merely having a psychiatric illness in itself also does not seem to in any way necessarily affect one's capacity to consent to complex questions. And this is a paper that Megan Campbell in the Department of Psychiatry wrote a few years ago, where she looked at people giving consent to cell line creation and immortalization in a schizophrenia genomic study, where she found that actually critically looking at people's both capacity and the outcome of their decisions didn't actually substantively differ between the controls unaffected by psychiatric illness and the cases who were people with a diagnosis of schizophrenia who were not acutely psychotic. So the evidence, the blanket assumption that people with psychiatric illnesses are always vulnerable and have impaired capacity to consent is very gradually being challenged in literature, and a more nuanced account of capacity in the psychiatric arena is starting to emerge. Now, specific to children and to the question of capacity is, of course, the question of age. And there's a really odd kind of tension in South African law where for clinical treatment, so complex clinical decisions, children of beyond 12 years of age with sufficient maturity can consent, and you will know that, can consent to most therapies, not all. But in the laws surrounding research, so the National Health Act, for instance, prescribe that people under 18 years of age cannot consent independently. So, and this is very odd, right? And that provision in the law and in the national guidelines is a blanket provision. So there's no gradual recognition of people's evolving maturity, for instance. There's also no recognition of people like minimal risk research versus invasive research and things like that. So there's a tension here that needs to be resolved, because it doesn't, it's a tension, it's uncomfortable, but also what the requirements for research predict is actually in direct conflict with what the Children's Act says, which is that children have the right to participate in decisions about them if they are sufficiently mature. Now, the way that is resolved in practice is that the National Health Research Ethics Guidelines that we all need to follow propose that children younger than 18, but with sufficient maturity, although the national guidelines don't use that concept, characterize consent as simply a permission for the child to be approached for research participation. So what the National Health Research Ethics Guidelines propose is that for children who have the ability to reason through decisions and understand information and so forth, that in those cases, children are the ones that really give consent. Parents are merely the people who give permission for the child to be contacted. So as one starts to involve older children and adolescents, that's a really important guideline. And the challenge, I think, is that guideline isn't consistently applied. So what the ethics committee tends to do is that they seek that they want consent both from the parents and from the children, right? So you get two consent forms that explain the full study. That is specifically not what the National Health Research Ethics Guidelines say. The national guidelines also say that if research is of minimal risk, involves competent children, or is on sensitive topics whilst of high potential benefit, then it may be appropriate to request a waiver of parental consent. So the standard there is very high. One cannot simply proceed with research without involving the parents in some way, unless you can demonstrate that your research matches those four criteria, where, for instance, research on sensitive topics might be research about the parents. Imagine research on domestic violence, for instance, sexual abuse, or sexual activity of young people. And the research would be unlikely to be successful if parental permission was required. Then in that case, what the national guidelines require is to conduct some form of community engagement with relevant stakeholders, which could be the school advisory body, it could be a local community organization, or some form of community engagement with relevant people who agree that a waiver of parental consent is appropriate, and who also agree that the safeguards in place to protect children and adolescents is appropriate. And then the documented evidence of that process then needs to be submitted to an ethics committee, who then decides per study whether or not a waiver of parental consent is appropriate. So that's a high standard. So basically all research in South Africa requires parental consent, which can be understood as permission for the child to be contacted. But in most cases, children don't necessarily give consent themselves, at least not legally. They cannot consent independently. There is then an evolution of how we think about consent with growing ages. So for children who are very young, we speak about assent. And assent is the absence of active refusal, right? So assent means being okay with whatever you're being asked to do. So in a very young child, the example could be, even if the parent says, yes, do this whatever painful procedure on my child, if the child is fighting and screaming and doesn't want to be pricked or whatever, then that's not assent, right? So bodily refusal can be a withholding, can be conceptualized in this discussion as a withholding of assent. As children get older and are able to read, researchers tend to start to use written summaries of the study themselves. So it could be a paragraph written in language that is age appropriate that says, we would like you to participate. This is not for your benefit, but it does these other things, and this is what we're asking you to do. Are you okay with that? And then as children get older, people start to use forms that look more and more like the actual consent form that is being used in the study. So assent and consent kind of evolve with the children's age, but technically the law says that children under the age of 18 cannot consent independently unless an ethics committee has provided a waiver of parental consent. So I won't say very much about these other two concepts, but I'll say a little. So the second element, so all of that was about the capacity to consent. I'll now say a little bit about comprehension, which is a question of how much information is provided. So we speak about sufficient and adequate information. Now, the tension for researchers, especially if they're clinicians, is to just offload information on the consent form. So one more brick, urinalysis, what, come in week 3, don't wear sunglasses. And it's almost that there is a tendency to treat consent documentation as if it is the leaflet that you read with medicines, like lots and lots and lots of information that is really incomprehensible. And just to give you an example, when I was part of the UCT Research Ethics Committee, the Faculty of Health Sciences Research Ethics Committee, I did these tests, right? I wanted to understand how long it would take me to read these really difficult consent forms. And it sometimes took me over an hour. And these forms are written in English, right? And I'm conversant in English. I'm sufficiently used to using English to be able to sort of understand the information, even if I didn't completely understand it all. Now, how a layperson is to make sense of that is really difficult. So the basic message here is, when we speak about comprehension, what we speak about is the provision of sufficient or adequate information, but not full information. And the way that we think about that is sufficient information is what a capable, non-expert layperson thinks is important to know in order to make an informed, reasoned decision. So that's the That's the criteria. And in practice, in research, nurses are actually really well positioned to think through, what is the kind of information that is key and what information isn't. So members of research teams that are very close to participants, field workers, nurses, are usually really good at making that assessment as how do, what information do people need to know to make an informed decision? And how can we present that information in a way that people understand? And the key message there is that consent is not a contract, and it is certainly not an indemnity form. And the moment that consent forms or consent documentation start to look like indemnity forms, or like a contract, we're kind of striking the wrong tone, right? So it's not that. Consent is about helping people make good decisions, and not on the basis of full information, but on the basis of the kind of information that they need in order to understand. And so we're working towards not an overloaded donkey, but a donkey that can smile through life. Cool. The last concept is voluntariness. So consent needs to be given by somebody without undue inducement or coercion. And we think about that in different ways. So obviously, offering money for participation is standard and common, but there's a critical question about when the provision of money becomes an undue inducement. So offers, pressure, or threats impact on voluntariness. But it can also be, so in the photo on the right, is a photo I took of an enrollment process in Gambia, and you can just from the body language of the nurse and the mother, you can just see this tension, right? The pressure that comes from being a professional clinician in a white coat versus being a mother and not quite understanding, you're seated lower. This pressure there that impacts on voluntariness. Now, voluntariness is a really intractable concept because it's very difficult to understand exactly when decisions are entirely voluntary and when they're actually being inducements. And the question isn't just when is something an inducement, the question is when is it undue? So, for instance, the example is that many of us would not be on this call today if we didn't get a salary, right? So we wouldn't be here if there wasn't some money showing up into our account on the 25th of every month. Now, that's an inducement, right? Our salary is an inducement for us to spend our time working. Is it undue? No, it's voluntary, right? We voluntarily decide that actually to have a decent life, we work. Similarly, we always offer money for participation, right? Because asking people to use their time and their own resources to help you meet what you need, right? Their participation would be not right. The question is, when is money too much, right? So in that schizophrenia study that I spoke about, they offered quite a bit, but they found that they got all kinds of people wanting to participate. They're a bit overwhelmed because the amount that they were offering was actually an undue inducement. So it made people decide to do things that they would not otherwise have decided, or take risks that they would not otherwise have taken if it wasn't for that inducement. So voluntariness is a challenging concept in bioethics, but it's a really important one, and one that we need to safeguard. So just some concluding thoughts. So in summary, consent is the permission to do something to someone which invariably involves asking them to give up some of their rights. It is consent given voluntarily by a capable person on the basis of sufficient information. And what is central to consent is the process of communication. And in fact, increasingly in literature and in ethics guidance, consent is not spoken about as a discrete event, but actually as a process that promotes the ability of individuals to make good decisions. And what we are finding is that when we use formal assessments to assess capacity and comprehension with a process of iterative learning, right, where we then revisit information that people didn't understand, actually seems to improve the quality of consent. Some acknowledgements, so that's all on my side. Let me stop sharing my screen. So I hope you found that useful. It's just some kind of broad reflections about consent and what it aims to do and achieve in the research process, deliberately silent on clinical aspects of consent. Over to you, Petrus.
Great. Thank you very much, Jantina, for a wonderful presentation. And I will now stop the recording, and then we have some time for discussion and questions from everyone. So first, I'm going to ask everyone to give you an electronic round of applause, and then we'll go to the next part of our meeting.